Hello, and welcome to Clinical Liver Disease video series. CLD is an official digital learning publication of the ASLD. I'm Kim To. I'm one of the assistant professors of digestive disease at Yale University and an associate editor of the social media section with CLD. I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Daniel Shouval, professor of medicine and hepatology from Hadassah Hebrew University Hospital, to discuss his article, The History of Hepatitis A. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, this is indeed a pleasure to talk about the history of hepatitis A. It's a very long story. It goes thousands of years backwards, and probably the time is too short to give tribute to all those who really contributed to the description and to the understanding of what has happened in the last several thousand years, and especially in the past 60 to 70 years. Hepatitis A is an enteric virus which has affected humans for ages. It's transmitted mainly by fecal-oral transmission, but also very prevalent in countries with low socioeconomic conditions, in countries where the water is contaminated, where there is no access to clean water, and it is also affecting not only children but also military troops. And in many wars over the years, we have had outbreaks of hepatitis A. The disease itself has already been described by Hippocrates in the 5th century, and probably also before. And apparently, because it caused jaundice in part of those who were infected, it actually received the name of epidemic jaundice. And the viral etiology of the disease was only discovered much, much later. But we owe some of our understanding, or the initial understanding, how hepatitis A is really transmitted, to a British hepatologist by the name of Dr. McCallum, who in the 1940s, after the Second World War, actually termed the hepatitis types to hepatitis A and hepatitis B. This was not known before. Today, of course, we know there are many other hepatitis viruses from A to E, but at that time, there were actually two forms of hepatitis which were transmitted either through contaminated blood and blood products and through contamination of water and food. And actually, the initial understanding about transmission and about the epidemiology of hepatitis A was studied by a number of really outstanding clinicians and epidemiologists, including the late Saul Krugman, who was a pediatrician, and clinician whose name has been forgotten by the name of Villarejos in Costa Rica, about whom I'm going to talk a little later, and then by a number of outstanding biologists, physicians, and molecular biologists who have assisted us in not only describing the clinical manifestations of the disease, but also in prevention through the development of means for protection, like initially the immune serum globulin, the gamma globulin, and later on by vaccines. I think the turning point in understanding hepatitis A occurred toward the end of the Second World War. Then, after a few years, the first transmission studies were performed, which were at the time somewhat controversial because volunteers have been asked to ingest contaminated food.
Oh my goodness.
Today, this would not pass any institutional review boards committees, but it was part of the, how shall I say, a practice to try to study new biologic agents. And one of those investigators was Saul Krugman, who conducted a number of transmission studies in mentally retarded children in Willowbrook in the United States. This has met a lot of criticism at the time, but subsequently, Dr. Krugman's observations actually contributed to the understanding that there are at least two forms of hepatitis viruses. Later we discovered several more. And it took some years until a German scientist who was living in the United States by the name of Fritz Deinhardt, Professor Deinhardt, has done some transmission studies in marmosets, in small apes, to show that this disease is transmissible using fecal extracts of contaminated patients. It took quite a number of years, and there have been some really outstanding scientists through the years who have studied the disease, initially very observant clinicians, and then biologists and molecular biologists. And I just want to name a few. As I said before, one of them was the Costa Rica physician by the name of Villarejos, and there were others like Jan Gast in Australia, and quite a number of investigators at the National Institute of Health in the United States, like Bob Purcell, and then Steve Feinstein, about whom I'm going to talk soon. In any case, the hepatitis caused by this virus is really debilitating disease. It is not as harmful as for instance, hepatitis B or hepatitis C, which have long-term effects, and the disease is short-limited in terms of time, and most of the infected individuals recover, but still it causes incapacitation, and currently, even in the last years, the Centers for Disease Control is actually estimating that about 30 million patients worldwide had symptomatic hepatitis A per year in the last couple of years, and about 35,000 deaths every year. Now, we have no time to go through the whole history of the disease and the investigators who worked on it, but it is important to note that the major breakthrough, there were a number of major breakthroughs which are worthwhile mentioning. One of them was the discovery of the virus itself by Stephen Feinstein at the National Institute of Health in the United States. He has obtained some stool extracts from patients from Australia that, by the way, were sent by airmail to me. Really unbelievable today. And Stephen Feinstein has identified the virus through electron microscopy, immune electron microscopy, and published his well-known paper in Science in 1973, describing the viral particles in the stools of infected individuals. These stool specimens were sent to Bob Purcell and Stephen Feinstein, I think by Jan Gask in Australia. Everything was done by mail. The other person, Dr. Villarejos, has sent stool specimens to Merck Sharp and Dohme in the United States also, the manufacturing of vaccines, to one of the real giants in vaccinology by the name of Maurice Hilleman. Maurice Hilleman was one of the great vaccinologists. He discovered like 9 vaccines over the years and has contributed to the safety and well-being of millions of individuals, and especially children worldwide. And Maurice Hilleman, who got a sample of these viral particles from the stools imported from Costa Rica, has given them to a scientist at Merck Sharp and Dohme by the name of Phil Provost, who was able to propagate the virus in culture, something that has never occurred before. And through the experiments of Dr. Provost and Dr. Hilleman, they generated an attenuated virus, which was has kept its antigenicity and was ideal for production of a vaccine, but was less virulent. And from this attenuated virus, Merck Sharp and Dohme actually developed the first vaccine against hepatitis A that was licensed in the early 1990s. A similar path occurred at the NIH, where the virus that was described by Dr. Feinson and by Dr. Purcell was also propagated in culture and given to another company in the United States, where I think it was Smith, Kline and French at that time, and then called GSK, who developed a very similar hepatitis A vaccine. Both of these vaccines were actually inactivated by formaldehyde. They were not live vaccines, and they have been used in the past almost 30 years very, very successfully in prevention of hepatitis A. In parallel, scientists in China have developed a completely different approach and developed what we call a live attenuated vaccine, which is actually a viral particles which have lost somewhat their virulence, but still are immunogenic and are given like the polio vaccine. They are actually live and not inactivated. And in China, they are used for immunization. All hepatitis A vaccines are today outstanding vaccines and very immunogenic and providing protection against the disease and against the infection for decades. Mm-hmm. There have been quite a number of pioneers in this area in understanding the molecular organization, the molecular epidemiology, and the identification of the virus. And I only mention a few of them, like Omana Nainan, who passed away a few years ago, who was a scientist at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, and especially Dr. Lemon, Stan Lemon, who has for the past 20 or 30 years worked in identification of the virus, the virological characterization, and has followed the development of the understanding and also the vaccines for many, many years. Time is really short to go describe all what has happened in this area, and I hope I did not forget some of the more important contributors in this article that we are talking about. But in any case, it is now important to mention that the vaccine has been extremely successful, is very safe, has very few side effects, and most vaccinees respond in developing protection. My country, Israel, was the first country in the world which introduced universal vaccination to all toddlers against hepatitis A. And as a result, the disease has vanished in Israel. And actually, the hepatitis A was so frequent that it was really, you could see it everywhere, but today we have an incidence of similar to Scandinavia, which means very, very low incidence. Now 11 countries have adopted already protocols for universal vaccination of babies and toddlers, including, of course, the United States, who was one of the first countries who started to immunize babies against hepatitis A. I think I will stop here.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shouval, for that whirlwind of a review historically, and also, what endeavors all the scientists and doctors have done in the last, decade, oh, not decade, 60 to 70 years, as you said, to accomplish what we're doing now for our patients. So I thank you again for joining us for another installment in the Clinical Liver Disease video series. And thank you to our readers for joining us. On behalf of all of us on the CLD team, I hope that you found this interview as interesting and inspiring as I have. For more information about the history of hepatitis A, please visit us at www.cldlearning.com. And also don't forget to follow us on Twitter at CLD Learning. Thanks again for watching.